In this episode, we're talking with economist Peter Tulip, and we're going to explore whether the target of 1.2 million new dwellings over the next 5 years is feasible. If so, where should we be building these new housing? And what else can be done to ease the pressure? Is cutting immigration the answer? Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, recently ranked number 5 in Australia out of over 18,000 brokers in the annual MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of an appropriate and experienced professional.
Our guest today is Peter Tulip, Chief Economist at the Centre for Independent Studies. He's previously worked in the research department of the Reserve Bank of Australia and before that at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. His recent research focuses on housing and monetary policy, and he's very vocal about the merits of high-density living. In fact, he might well be Australia's oldest YIMBY. Now, welcome back, Peter. We always have a spirited, thought-provoking conversation whenever you come onto the podcast, and we really appreciate you joining us again today.
Glad to be with you, Veronica. Hi, Chris.
Peter, hi. Last time we chatted, I just should have checked exactly what it was, but it was before, some of the drastic action that, Chris Minns is sort of, and can you just give us your update on, a lot of listeners may know about this, but, it's real time, right? It's happening right now. And what's your take on it? Is it going to get watered down? There's already talk that that's happening. And is it a good thing? And have they done it the right way?
So as background, okay, great. As background, the National Cabinet met last year and had a target of 1.2 million homes over the next 5 years, which we should talk about soon, because some people don't think that that's feasible.
Yeah.
That's a good. But it's but everyone does agree it's a very ambitious target. And it involves pretty much producing at our peak level of construction over an extended period of time. Against that background, New South Wales, where the housing affordability problems are worst and where there's most need for more building, the New South Wales government has been announcing a whole series of new housing policies with the aim of greatly increasing housing construction, especially in Sydney. And one of them is that they want a lot of medium density housing around train stations. They've named 39 specific areas where they want a very substantial uplift. But more broadly, they're wanting much greater access to granny flats, dual occupancy, townhouses, in what previously was low density housing. So that's what they've announced, and it's extremely controversial that a lot of the local councils are strongly opposed to what the government is doing, partly because of the process that the local councils don't like being told to do by the state government. They don't think that there's been adequate consultation, but also just in terms of the outcome, that a lot of people do not like the idea of apartments and townhouses in their suburb.
What do you think, Peter? Have the locations and the size, do you think it's enough? Do you think it's been a little bit heavy-handed, and they haven't really been engaging with the councils enough and it's been a little bit too prescriptive?
Right, so a few questions there. Yes, I think it is heavy-handed and there hasn't been much consultation, and ordinarily you would like these things to be much more consultative. But the process of asking councils to do this by themselves, in my assessment, has failed. That the previous government was setting targets for councils and hoping that they would adhere to them. They haven't been. Yeah. The previous process is just failing. And the most clear evidence of that is just the affordability problem keeps getting worse and worse and worse. We're just not building enough. So I think some urgency is both understandable or even necessary. And the government has said that councils can come up with their own plans if they have a similar level of uplift. So it is free for councils to do better if they think they can. But I think it is appropriate for them to give the whole process a quick push along and move quickly. I think, Chris, you also asked whether it's enough. And I think the answer to that is no, that what they have been announced. So it's hard to know how many dwellings these proposals will deliver. But some of the estimates that are out there suggest that it falls. So, I mean, we've got a national contribution of a national target of 1.2 million. I think that means a 5-year target in New South Wales of, is that, I think, 280,000. Oh, no, 370,000, I think. So, I can't.
Few 100,000.
Yeah. But I think that means about 75,000 a year in New South Wales. We're only doing about 40,000, depending on exactly how you measure it. So we're falling very badly short. Whether what they've announced will bring us up to that 75,000, I don't think it will, but then there are a lot of other things that they still could announce, like we don't know what's happening with greenfields developments in the western suburbs of Sydney. We don't know what's happening in regional New South Wales. There's scope for a lot more housing in many of our rural towns, and there haven't been any announcements on that yet. So the short answer to your question is what they've announced so far is not enough, but I expect there is more coming in the pipeline.
So announcing it's one thing, rezoning is one thing, putting, impositions on councils and whatever is one thing. But you got to have developers, builders, supply, the wherewithal. As you said, we've got to be building at peak levels of construction for the entire 5 years to achieve something we've never achieved before. And that, given the ramp-up time, and given it seems to be that New South Wales is being the most aggressive in terms of the state government's approach to this, and other state governments aren't quite so aggressive from what I can understand. So the ramp up to getting to peak approvals, let alone peak construction, is, fairly long. And that means that sort of puts more pressure on the back end of this 5 years, doesn't it? I mean, Does all this mean that it's not really feasible?
It certainly is not feasible under the old regime, and previous policy would not deliver it. To get a big increase in construction so that our housing stock grows substantially faster than our population requires a change in policy. So in New South Wales, we are seeing that being announced, at least, yet, as you say, yet to be implemented, yet to be enforced. And we're definitely not seeing the construction numbers turning up yet. And we probably won't see that for several quarters at least, but it may even be measured in years.
Do we have capacity, though, when it does?
That's a good question. And the only way we find out is by trying, isn't it? So we were doing peak levels of production a few years ago. I think it was 2017 or 2018. If we attain that recent peak level, then we hit the target. I mean, if we can keep doing that for 5 years. So all of those plumbers and carpenters and bricklayers haven't gone away. Well, yeah, a tiny number of them were retired and everything, but in fact, the construction workforce seems to have increased since then. One of the problems is a lot of them are doing small household jobs, renovations and things like that. And, because there is not the high volume work that might otherwise occupy them. And what I think will happen is if we do start putting up apartments and we start seeing more cranes arising over the horizon, that a lot of the workers will come off, fixing up back decks or, mending fences, and they'll start working on the really high value projects. And a change in wages may be necessary for that, and a change in immigration may be necessary for it also.
We will definitely get to immigration, but while we're talking about sort of peak construction levels, the thing that sort of popped into my mind when you talked about the times at which we were at peak construction is the legacy of that and the defects and the problems that the owners of a lot of these buildings, or a lot of the lots within these buildings are now grappling with. And so, how can we manage this whole thing in an orderly fashion that then doesn't create a knock-on effect for the people that sort of pile in because they're desperate for somewhere to live, and then they end up with worse off affected?
So my outfit, the Centre for Independent Studies, is what's often called a libertarian outfit. We believe in free markets and limited government, but we're not, and certainly I'm not a zealot. That I think there are some regulations in the housing sector that are very bad and harmful, and in particular the zoning regulations we've discussed. But there are other regulations, and in particular the building code, where I think there's a lot of scope for tightening things. So you can change the planning code, which determines the quantity of housing, to allow for a greater quantity, while at the same time tightening up the building code, which to improve the quality. So, that's a principal argument. In terms of specifics, I actually don't think that the building code needs to be changed very much. What needs to be changed is the enforcement. and in particular, I think private certification has not worked well. And a lot of the problems we're seeing is because the incentives for certifiers to properly check that work is done up to code have not been there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've had a lot of dodgy projects approved that should not have been. And that is really harmful and means buyers don't trust new apartments.
Mm.
Peter, I've been tracking this story quite tightly because I think it's a massive story, right? It's happening in New South Wales, and it's a bit of a canary in the coal mine what could happen in other cities around the country, right? There's been sort of talk on the Wallara Council, right, being some heritage overlays on buildings that probably don't deserve heritage overlays. What's your sort of...
You're steal my dumbo.
But there you go. The other sort of, the Haberfield area.
Yeah.
You look at like around Balmain and the Bays precinct, right? Like, you can build up to 9 stories around that. In all, like $2 million terraces are going to have to come down. Like that have been there for 100 plus years. Like, what's your, thoughts on the heritage aspect to these and the blanket rezoning? And, is that going to be, are we going to come back in the future and say or should we just sort of protect heritage in real heritage pockets? Like, like where the streets are perfectly all heritage rather than, across whole suburbs. Like, should we just let go of a little bit of heritage to do this, or do we need to think about heritage over the top of it?
I think heritage has been greatly overused.
Right.
I don't think anyone disagrees with the idea of preserving buildings that are unusually old or unusually attractive. But what's happened with our heritage listing is its blanket classification of almost entire suburbs. Haberfield you mentioned, but most of Glebe or Balmain or Wallara or Paddington, I think it's half of the city of Sydney and about 30 or 40% of the Inner West Council area. Similar areas in the old parts of Sydney. And a lot of it is pretty ordinary housing. You get streets of just, regular suburban houses. And the owners don't want to be heritage listed It means they can't do renovations, or in some cases they can't even choose their own paint colour. And it's really harmful in terms of housing affordability. It really restricts our ability for people to live in areas where they want to live.
There's very few areas that have that level of heritage restriction, though. I mean, Haberfield is one rare example of a suburb that has, heritage overlay because of it was the first planned suburb in Sydney, and Hunters Hill has a heritage overlay over the entire suburb as well, and it's a peninsula and there's a particular type of architecture there. Glebe and Balmain and suburbs like that, they've got conservation areas, and it doesn't have the same onerous responsibilities or conditions placed on owners and their renovations, but it will impact things like, going up into the attic and putting dormer windows in and floor space ratio and stuff like that. And streetscape, it's the idea is you almost do whatever you want behind the front wall as long as you can't see any change from the street.
Well, that's a really big condition.
Yeah, well, it is. But when you've only got a 120 square metre block of land, you know what I mean? There's constraints created by sheer size of the property in the first place. And that's not uncommon, say, in Balmain. But the thing is that, with all these rezoning, when you're looking at, say, that obviously hit the news, that was like something like a 1.2 kilometre radius, redevelopment or some rezoning. I mean, there's got to be some sheer economic limitations on that all being knocked down and suddenly turned into high-rise. I mean, those individual houses on their little tiny blocks of land, each one is going to cost a significant amount to buy. So, therefore, the site value is extraordinarily high. There's got to be lower-hanging fruit, surely, for developers.
No, I think the reason a lot of this land is so incredibly expensive is because it's incredibly well located and incredibly attractive.
Yes.
And it's a pretty inefficient use to have land which is within walking distance of the CBD being reserved for, in many cases, single-story detached house. Well, okay, a lot of it isn't detached, a lot of it is terraces, but it's pretty low density housing on some of the most valuable real estate in the country.
Yeah, but my question around that is that how feasible is it going to be if you rezone it? How feasible is it going to be for developers to be able to come in, make enough of a profit, find enough willing owners to part with it? You know what I mean? Like it's
so after Minns and Scully announced that the transport-oriented development with 39 stations having big developments. In particular, they're allowing up to about 6 stories within 400 metres of these 39 stations. People that were living within that circle, within the 400 metres, have just been absolutely inundated with offers.
Yeah.
But there is a complete opposite of a shortage of willing builders.
Hang on a minute. I'm not sure that's the case in the inner city areas. I've heard that, absolutely. I've heard that in the Upper North Shore.
Yeah. And that's where I live, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that around the, is it Gordon? Is it where, what is it?
Roseville is my suburb.
Roseville, yeah.
And that was actually a story in the Sydney Morning Herald, I think it was maybe a month or so ago, of how the local residents who, fortunately for them, live a bit closer to the train station than I do, they're just getting enormous numbers of incredibly lucrative offers for their property.
And that's sort of tempting, right?
But it's also different because each of those lots are bigger. You know what I mean? So you can buy fewer houses, and you're still going to be able to buy, build a block of units or townhouse or whatever you're going to build.
Typically what's happening is the residents are joining together and to sell in their properties in consolidated sale, which increases the value substantially.
Yeah.
And I mean, so developers want to put up big apartment buildings, and to do that, that's most profitable when you can consolidate.
Peter, just out of curiosity.
I think there was a story in the Sydney Morning Herald about focusing on glebe also. Yeah, where similar things are happening. Yeah, so there was one of my old economics professors, in fact, had his photo in the paper because he was offered several $1 million for his property.
How far away you? Just out of curiosity, just like as a discussion point, how far away are you from the station, Peter?
I'm outside the circle.
Oh, no.
I'm a kilometre from Rose.
Okay. Yeah. So, like, if you think about this, though, like, okay, so you're inside that 400 buffer zone, right? Like, and you're getting these offers. Assuming people take it up, right? The amount of houses in Roseville decreases, right? Quite significantly, right? Because they get knocked down and they get turned to apartments and etc. Unless those owners then go buy one of those apartments and they're going to get built on their land, which may actually happen, actually, because the reality is they probably will target the downsizer market with those developments. But ultimately, people who do want to stay in Roseville are going to go, hey, I just want to buy outside that 400-metre buffer zone, right? Because people don't really want to change their suburb. And they want to cash in because, look, if they don't cash in, they're going to get a high-rise next to them. And it makes sense. So, you could still find that an amenity of the suburb will go up, right? Because, you're going to get some more cafes, you're going to get some commercial, you're going to get a whole new, the suburb's going to get a new lease of life, do you think? Do you think that that's going to be good for people like you a kilometre away? Or do you think that, that's not going to be great for your suburb? How do you take it?
It'll be great for us. We'll get, the hope is with more people, we'll get a butcher, a grocer and a pub. All of which Roseville is lacking at the moment. Because it's all low density housing, so there's just not the demand. A lot of I'll call them neighbours, other people that live in Roseville, have been living here for decades.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of empty, so I think the median age in the suburb is something like 50, just a decade or two above the national average. And there are a lot of empty nesters. And in fact, I think the Herald story I mentioned earlier featured one of them who'd been living in her house for 50 years. And, she now had this 5-bedroom house. The family's all left. And this has actually been a real social problem in suburbs like mine, that the empty nesters, when their children's gone, they find they're living in these huge houses with big gardens, but it no longer suits their lifestyle. They don't need the rooms. The garden actually becomes a pain. They don't use the swimming pool, and they hate the stairs. So for a lot of reasons, they would like to downsize or move to an apartment close to the shops in walking distance of places. But in suburbs like mine, it's just not an available opportunity. Because it's all detached houses, that there hasn't been the choice for people who would like to stay in the same neighbourhood to find more appropriate accommodation. And in fact, if we would just to facilitate that, there'd be a substantial increase in the supply of houses. So these pensioner retirees living with multiple spare unused bedrooms, moving to a smaller apartment means there's a lot of space for a family.
So what you're talking about there is it's a different affordability conversation, isn't it? You're talking about a very affluent area where there are a lot of, as I was talking to somebody up there only a couple of weeks ago, said, well, there's no Labor voters up here. That's why it's happened, So the Liberal voters don't want it. They're the NIMBYs, not like you. You're a YIMBY. Yeah. They don't want it. Mind you, you're a K out, so you're not really going to be affected. You're going to get all the positives and none of the negatives. So you're not going to sort of have to uproot your life and watch your house get demolished. You're also not going to have to live next door to a new block of apartments if you decide to stay put. And you can see the lifestyle benefits that could potentially come to your area by more diversity of housing, the opportunity for people to downsize and stay close to where their networks are, but also just increased, recreational options. So that can all be seen as real positives, but there's been certainly some areas where density hasn't brought, despite all the promises, hasn't brought that. like a lot of density. I was reading an article about sort of apartment, the vacancies of shops underneath these modern apartment buildings. So I see them even just walking around inner Sydney where I am, and quite often I'm walking past buildings that have got empty shops. They've never been occupied. There's some areas, whole suburbs that have this sort of problem. They've got lots and lots of people, and yet the promise of this lifestyle and these the community centres and everything has not been fulfilled. Where do you think they've gone wrong? They have not delivered those vibrant community centres that has been the big promise.
So there are lots of issues there. Vacant shops is, I think, primarily an issue of rents, that partly relating to the pandemic, that there have been huge changes in the demand for commercial space. And in particular, there's a lot more working from home, and partly related to that, the demand for a lot of commercial space has fallen off, especially in the CBD, less so sort of out in the suburbs. And a lot of rents just haven't adjusted to that yet. The rents are just tend to be very sluggish on the way up and very sluggish on the way down. And even there's been, so part of the problem with these vacant shops is that the retailers have found much more attractive options elsewhere, and the landlords are yet to adjust. I mean, they're hoping that if they advertise long enough, they'll find a new tenant, and it tends to take people a long time before they realise, no, we need to cut the rent. But yes, eventually that'll happen, and the places will be filled up again.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a time when you want to really start a business. Really, consumer confidence is really low. Interest rates are high. There's talk of recessions. It's hard to get talent and staff, and it's counter-cyclical. It could be, right, if no one else is opening. But ultimately, I think it's not usually the right environment to encourage people to take risk, I guess. Hey, what's your take on the RBA stance right now and the global inflation story? It's a bit of a different tact, but it's even just today, the US numbers of inflation have sort of surprised to the upside, and those guaranteed rate cuts that we thought with 2024 would happen apparently won't happen now. You've been there, you've been on the front, in both of those, the here and overseas. So what do you think?
So in the past, I've been very critical of the Reserve Bank. The settings of monetary policy, I've often been very different to the ones I would like. But now I think it's about right. It's hard to judge where the economy is going. That inflation is too high, but it's coming down. The unemployment rate is probably lower than we think can be sustained, but will probably be increasing substantially. So I would be a bit more inclined to tighten than to loosen. In particular, I worry about the inflation numbers, that it's not coming down to 2.5%, which is the midpoint of the target, for several years, which I think is too long. It's too risky. There's shocks will come along to blow them off target, and that becomes a problem. But I don't want to be strident or angry about this. So it's a close call, and when they're talking about differences of 25 or 50 basis points, so it's not a huge difference.
If you go back to pre-COVID, though, we were going to this lower interest rate environment all around the world and negative interest rates. And do you think that those days of that bond rally and the depressing of interest rates and, really struggling to get growth and inflation, do you think those days are done, or we're going to go back to those days? We're on a new path now?
Every time someone says those days are done, we would hear them. It's who knows? It's very difficult to tell, and it's certainly a contingency that we need to be better prepared for than we were last time. So when interest rates fell to zero in 2020, the Reserve Bank was scrambling. It didn't really know what to do, and it ended up doing things that just a few months earlier it had said were off the field.
Yeah.
So it did look, there was an understandable lack of planning, and they changed tack fairly seriously over the course of 2020. So they need to think more about what happened, but that's a very active area of research in the central banking community, and people are reviewing those experiences closely with a view to distilling what the lessons are. And I don't think there's agreement on that yet, but people are thinking it through.
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. And you can find out all about what I'm working on at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you'll find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program, access to suburb help for investors, or if you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, you can connect with my team at Good Deeds Property Buyers.
If you're thinking about buying your first home, upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and importantly get the finance right. Please reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
It's funny. I mean, I was actually listening to Stuart Williams' podcast this morning, and he was just reviewing the last 20 years of property prices versus the previous 20 years. And a lot of us talk about the shocks we've had, in the last 20 years versus, and he said, well, actually, there was lots of, systemic change and structural change and shocks that happened actually the previous 20 years as well, which is either we weren't alive or we've got short memories. And I think that's, like you said, these things just, is this new? Is this unprecedented? Maybe not. I think the pressure on, the cost of living pressures that are happening is sort of back to the affordability, I guess. They're very real in many cases and in many quarters across the country at the moment. And obviously with interest rates where they are currently, there's a segment of our community that are more impacted than others and bearing the brunt. And I don't know, it's totally... it's definitely off the property tangent, but I'm looking at the amount of events that are being cancelled, you can really see the disposable income going, yeah, is that important to me now? No. And you can argue there's lots of the delayed shocks, I guess, from COVID and from stimulus and from, people's bank accounts being full and bad business practices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of discussion around all of that. But the fact is, sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background there. The fact is that this is all going on. This is pressure that we are all experiencing, and it's starting to feel real, And so how does that, from the Reserve Bank's point of view, they've only got one lever here. How does it have to get, I guess, before they will find pressure to put rates down?
What is needed is convincing evidence that inflation will head towards 2.5% and the unemployment rate will head to a sustainable level, which we think might be around 4.5%. And if it looks like and that's what the Reserve Bank is hoping for in maybe 2 years' time, getting to something like that, maybe in 2 years' time. And if that does happen, they will reduce interest rates gradually. If it looks like we get there quicker, they'll drop rates quickly. If progress towards those goals slows, then it's quite likely they'll increase rates. So it depends on how the economy evolves.
Yeah, so I guess, your answer there is a very measured answer in terms of what the Reserve Bank's goal targets are, and we've all got to stop spending money, but that's really hard when rents are going up and the inflation is largely driven by services at the moment, et cetera, et cetera. So just buckle up. Is that what you're saying? We just have to be patient?
So things are going to be especially difficult if you've got a large mortgage. Because interest rates risen very substantially. And so, okay, and that's good for a lot of retirees, people who live on.
Yeah.
And people forget that when people are talking about interest rates, for every loser, there's a gainer.
Yeah.
If every dollar that is paid in higher mortgage payments tends to go to, either someone with a certificate deposit at the bank or shares in the bank. So it's a redistribution. It's not, doesn't overall reduce living standards. So they're doing it tough. Unemployment will probably increase. So they're the people that will most suffer, the people that lose their jobs and can't find others.
Particularly if they've got a big mortgage.
Yeah, for most other people, most of us are getting big tax cuts in 2 months' time, 3 months' time, so beginning in July. So things will be easier for everyone else.
What's your thoughts on immigration, Peter? We have a very desirable country. We could, import talent from all over the world, and maybe they don't want to move here when they look at our property market. But what's your take on the catch up we've had post COVID? Is that really been an increase, or has it just been a catch up? And is it sustainable at the current levels? And should we increase it or decrease it? What's your take?
So it's a huge issue for a lot of reasons. One of which is what we were talking about before, the housing market. The reason rents are going up so incredibly quickly at the moment is because vacancies are extremely low, and the immediate reason for that is the immigration numbers have rocketed up. Though, to put that in context, a lot of that is just making up for the big shortfall in immigration we had while the borders were closed during the pandemic. And there's a sense in which we're just getting back to the level of population that we would have had if it hadn't been for the pandemic. On immigration, so I've done a paper estimating the effect of immigration on housing costs, and we estimated that the big increase in immigration rates over the past decade or two increased the cost of housing by about 9%. So it definitely does put upwards pressure on rents and housing prices. And a lot of people think that rather than, my proposal for dealing with the housing shortage is to allow more building, to change the zoning regulations. A lot of people would prefer that we cut the immigration numbers. My disagreement with that is not over effectiveness. Yes, if you reduce the immigration numbers, that would help reduce the housing shortage and would take some of the pressure off rents. My disagreement is over desirability. That in turn, if you're going to reduce the housing shortage, it's much better off doing it on the supply side than the demand side. They'll both work, but lower immigration tends to reduce living standards, whereas increased supply improves living standards. To get a bit more detailed than that, you need to talk about what kind of immigration you're changing, because the effects are very different depending on whether you're talking about skilled, unskilled, refugees, permanent, temporary, all of those variations. But the simplest case is, and the topical case, the government has just been announcing restrictions, is on student immigration, where they've substantially tightened up the student visas. In particular, by tightening, they're just not processing the visas. The problem with that is those university students from overseas pay very lucrative fees to our higher education authorities. And so education is our third biggest export industry. That export revenue we get from education is how we as a society pay for our TVs and clothes and shoes and cars, and so much of the way we live relies on purchasing imports. And that will be harder if we stifle one of our most successful export industries. In contrast, if you solve the housing problem by boosting supply, then people are better off. So, instead of having to live a 2-hour commute away, people would find housing within a 10, 15-minute commute from their work. That people wouldn't have to be living in their parents' basements as much. We wouldn't have overcrowding. We wouldn't have so much homelessness. In all sorts of different ways, extra supply makes us better off, whereas cutting demand, in particular through reducing immigration, makes us worse off.
Peter, if you had to I was about
to say, it always makes me laugh when they talk about reducing students, if you're going to pick a segment of immigrants, because I've been in properties that are rented to students and sometimes up to 4 of them sharing a bedroom. Like, in terms of the actual impact on the bedrooms available for the rest of Australians to rent or to purchase, then I would say that as a segment, they have to have the smallest amount of impact in terms of turning off the tap. But I guess also you're talking about supply and demand there. I mean, I would imagine it's more responsive to turn the tap on and off for on the demand side there in terms of in terms of immigration versus we already discussed how long it takes to build a dwelling. So how does that, I guess that the change or the difference in pace of those two aspects, how does that factor into the argument on this? Because I guess there's going to be people saying, well, we should turn off immigration now because we can do it quickly and then that's going to ease the pressure and give us time to catch up. I mean, is that a reasonable argument?
Yeah, I think that is true. That if you need to solve the housing crisis by June, then immigration is a lever you can pull on, whereas housing construction is not. But this housing shortage has been bad and getting worse for decades now. It's a very long problem, and so being told that I need to wait a few more months to solve it, is if I can get a solution that I have to wait a few months for it, I'd be delighted.
You'd be waiting.
Yeah. Peter, I guess when you look at the low-hanging fruit, right? So you're talking about supply, right? I think we're getting some action there, right? The government's talking about it. There's, Chris Minns. There's been a little bit of an attack on land tax as well, right? In Victoria, for example, trying to free up. When you've done all your research in your papers, what are some of the other low-hanging fruit where you really, if you want to move the needle, you can change some tax settings or, I don't know, maybe making the home capital gains tax, maybe you have to, you don't get the pension if your home's included, or, you pay land tax on your home. Like, what do you think some of the big things that would really encourage people? Because you can create more supply, but what would actually create more supply is, like you say, that moving people into better places that, forcing people to downsize, really, the empty nesters. What do you think?
So many of my other researchers that operate in my turf are fond of drawing up long lists of housing reforms that often will be 10 or 20 point programs for things that need to be done. And my view of that is that one of them is a huge one, is the elephant in the room, if I can use that phrase.
You can.
And pretty much everything else is tiny.
Right.
So the big thing is supply, and in particular zoning regulations, that we need to allow more building. Other things, I wouldn't say trivial, but are tiny. And if I can pick one example, because it's a lot of people are talking about it at the moment. I know, actually, I think Chris, you just mentioned it, negative gearing and the capital gains discount.
Yeah.
So Alan Kohler just did a very high-profile paper.
Yeah.
I'm saying that. Researchers have looked at this, the effect of the tax concessions on housing prices. And they've done a lot of good research in a lot of different ways, and they've all estimated that the effects are tiny. That if you were to, so they look at it in different ways, but if you were to do something like what the Labor Party took to the 2019 federal election, they estimate that would reduce house prices by, there's one estimate of 1%, there's another estimate of 2%, another estimate of 4%, and there are other estimates out there that are similar. And you compare that with the effect of zoning reform, where we're talking changes of 40 or 50%. Extra supply just has enormous effects on affordability, tax concessions. There are good arguments for changing the tax code, and I don't think in particular, the capital gains discount. I think there are good arguments for reforming that and changing that, but they relate to equity and tax policy design. In terms of housing affordability, it's just not an issue.
So, we're sort of in agreement with you. We've pulled apart a lot of those arguments, and so it's interesting, though, that you say that increased supply could impact that property values by 40%. Now, what exactly do you mean by that? Because it's political, all is political, right? So anything that's going to reduce the values of how many of us own property in this country, or the 11 million properties that exist, anything that's going to reduce the value of those properties owned by individuals, owned by voters, is not palatable, right? So what do you mean by a 40% reduction of value?
Right. So to be concrete, one simple example of what we're talking about is what's happened in Auckland. Back in 2016, Auckland used to be overwhelmingly low-density detached houses everywhere. And they had a big planning reform there, which essentially allowed medium-density housing for about 3/4 of the city. And as a result of that, construction doubled. And the housing stock last times, there have been several detailed research papers on this. The last time one of the most thorough of them looked at it, it had increased the housing stock in Auckland by about 4%, 4 or 5%. And the effect of that was to substantially reduce housing costs. In particular, if you look at rents in Auckland, then they've fallen relative to inflation, whereas in all the other cities in New Zealand, they've risen quite substantially. So if you take other cities like Wellington and Hamilton as a counterfactual for what might have happened to Auckland rents, the cost of housing has fallen about 20%. And that's not allowing high density, that's not transport-oriented development, that's just fairly broad scale. A lot of it is just townhouses and, 4 or 5 story apartments. Yeah.
So that's saying
that a lot more that can be done in those areas.
And so what you're saying there, if I can paraphrase it, tell me if I got it right, is that the composition, there's more housing, the composition is different, there's more sort of medium density, and so the cost to get in, or the median price, if you want to look at it, has come down, but the values of those individual houses that are less standing, I would imagine they've gone up. Would that, because all of a sudden the scarcity value, if you can afford to buy a freestanding house on its own block of land.
Well, in particular, the land that's now zoned for medium density housing tends to have increased.
So there's a one-off increase there, obviously. Yeah.
Because there's the option value of demolition and rebuilding flats on it. So that's increased. But what's most relevant in terms of housing affordability is the cost of floor space. And that's fallen very, very substantially relative to what it would have been otherwise.
Because of an increase in supply and a different type of stock that wasn't there before. Yeah.
Peter, when there's this upzoning, do you think that the council or the state governments should capture that in a tax at all? And, you know, because they've got a lot of costs, right? When you upzone, you've got to replace roads, you've got to replace sewerage, you've got, you know, a lot more demands on the town and the council's success. So do you think that there should be like an upzone tax that, you know, captures the over, like you sell your $2 million place for $3 or $4 million because of the rezoning, you should pay a tax on that even though it was your home?
Yeah, so yes, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is that we already have some measures that partially do that. And so infrastructure charges vary from state to state. I think in New South Wales tends to be about $12,000 per apartment that, you know, when a new block of flats is coming in, the developer needs to pay a substantial charge, which finances a lot of the infrastructure that you're talking about, the water and sewage and so on. It's also the case that if you're an investor or a landlord, then you'll pay capital gains tax on that increase in sales, which is not... Okay, so you still get most of the benefit of the uplift, but the government does capture a large share of it. I think most economists think that capital gains tax should also apply to owner-occupiers.
Yeah.
And whether or not they do, I believe that. And that would capture a substantial amount also. We talked about the capital gains discount. As I said before, I think that's questionable, that there are good arguments for getting rid of that discount. So there are, even within the current tax system, there are some relatively simple tweaks that would capture a very large share of the uplift. In the ACT, they have a betterment tax where increases in land value accompanied by upzoning. I think 3/4 of that goes to the ACT government. And I don't think it's especially well designed or well implemented, but in principle, I think that gets at a more fundamental policy that a lot of people are attracted to. It's whenever you talk about taxation of housing, it gets very, very controversial. It's very difficult. My personal agenda is based on the idea that increasing supply is controversial enough, and I don't want to bite off another big issue at the same time. So while I'm sort of sympathetic to the idea that government should capture more of this uplift, I think that just makes the issue a whole lot more controversial and difficult to sell. So as a priority, I don't think it makes sense to push that.
No, exactly. I mean, people have to start factoring that into their sales, and it's like they want more money, and then it just slows down the whole process. But yeah, you have to admit it's a bit of a free kick for them. And you know those costs you spoke about, they get passed on to the buyer, right? So they get factored into the sale price, and the developer has to pay higher for the land. And so you know if you
Okay, that depends on which specific tax we're talking about. In terms of taxes and charges, yes. So I think infrastructure charges most obviously going to be passed on to the buyer, as they should be. Yeah. The idea is you don't want people building houses on the top of a mountain
without a road.
That it's incredibly costly to connect the utilities to. Though if they're prepared to pay the hundreds of thousands of dollars required to service that property, then fine, it should go ahead. But user cost charging, I think, is how you decide where to build and where you shouldn't. other taxes, in particular value uplift charges, probably would not be passed on to the buyer. There it's the price is what the market will bear, and it's a question of whether that windfall goes to the government or to the landowner.
It's I guess if it's an investment property, then government gets a bit, but if it's not, they won't. But I mean, your thoughts on capital gains tax on the family home is interesting, because all I can think of is, well, that will really constrain upgrading, and that in turn will constrain price growth. So I guess that's one way to slow things down. Very unpopular, I would imagine.
You got to finish us off here, Peter, with a property dumbo. Did you have one up your sleeve? I know I stole one from you already with the Wallara example, but have you got another one for me?
Yeah, no, I mean, just the basic idea of heritage. That in a lot of cases, heritage protections make sense. That it's good to preserve buildings that are unusually old or unusually attractive. But some of what is being used with heritage is just dumb. And we mentioned earlier Haberfield, where there is talk about redeveloping some vacant land there that used to be owned by the Army. The Army decided they don't need it anymore. And so the council is talking about putting new suburban houses there. I mean, that's controversial, but what I laughed at was when one of the councillors said that they wanted heritage protections on the new houses.
Oh, right. God. Totally don't understand what it even means to even say that, boy.
So, yeah, that's a good one. I like it.
Heritage is just being used as a device to stop housing. And the other amazing example that's similar to this was down in Melbourne. There's an old concrete car park, 4 or 5 stories of raw concrete, which, okay, this is my own personal value judgment, but I think concrete car parks are about the ugliest structure that we see in cities.
Oh, a brutalist architect fan would love it, though. They would be like, this is the most gorgeous car park I've ever seen.
And what's happened is the decision was left up to 3 brutalist architects.
Yeah.
Who said exactly what you're saying, is that they just love raw concrete.
Yeah,
So this car park is being preserved under a Heritage Protection Act.
Oh, it's gold. You didn't actually mention about Wallara, what? Because Chris said, you said that's my dumbo, and we didn't finish the story. So tell us.
No, I was talking about heritage in particular.
But what has Wallara Council been doing?
So when I said you're stealing my dumbo, I was talking about bad heritage restrictions. I can't remember the heritage.
I think they're basically throwing on some pretty average apartment blocks on Edgecliff Road and just saying, this is heritage, and it's not like it's an amazing Art Deco building that's just completely unique. Like, it just is an old brick building that's, they're just trying to reduce that going from 6 levels to 9 levels, I think, from my understanding. And they've been slapping these heritage overlays on in the last 5 years because in anticipation that there's going to be a pressure for density, and
right,
and that's what I think they've been doing. So they're getting a bit of stick at the moment for being a bit over
cynical application of heritage overlays.
And it's happening about 1 block away from Edgecliff Station.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
And even then, it's within walking distance of the CBD.
Yeah,
or the harbour. I mean, this is some of the most valuable real estate in the country, and they're saying no. And you would think it'd be nice if thousands of people could enjoy it, could benefit from the amenities of this site. But they're saying no, they want it lower density, and they're using heritage as a roundabout way of achieving that.
So I hope that it's funny, Peter, you say you're a libertarian, but you sound a little bit like a socialist at times.
So can I talk a bit? I know you're winding up, but...
go.
I mean, one of the reasons that housing is interesting is that a lot of free market it tends to be have problems in terms of equality. I mean, it tends to hurt the poor and benefit the rich. And housing is the big exception to that, where a libertarian policy in housing benefits renters, benefits young home buyers, and the people it hurts are the wealthy property owners. So it's something that egalitarians and libertarians will agree on.
Thank you, Peter.
Really enjoyed that. Thank you.
We'd love to come back around in 6 months' time. Once we know more about these MINs, and we'll start to see if this development starts to pipe up, I guess. And if it's the plan of actually increasing application doesn't actually happen, or it really does happen. And like you say, there's banding together and some really good sales and development applications start increasing, and we start to see some light. But unfortunately, these things are 3-4 years down the line, right? So it's not going to be an immediate effect, but it's good long-term planning. So thanks so much for coming on, Pete.
My pleasure. I enjoyed your chat.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.